Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're going right to the core of, well, how we even understand the world, through language. And specifically, the meaning of words. Like, what does it even mean for a word to have meaning?
Yeah.
We're going deep with this one using the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy entry on word meaning.
Right. A classic, really. It lays out pretty much the whole history of thinking on this, like from ancient philosophy to modern debates in like philosophy of language and linguistics, cognitive science even, how our brains make sense of it all.
It is quite the journey, and it is surprisingly intricate.
Oh, absolutely.
So for everyone listening, consider this your guide, your kind of a philosophical expedition through all the major attempts to grapple with this idea. What does it mean for a word to mean something?
Yeah, it's not just about looking up definitions in a dictionary, though, right?
No.
The Stanford Encyclopedia entry really digs into how even figuring out what we mean by a word is way more complex than you might think.
Yeah.
And also, like, how early philosophers, they were so focused on sentence, meaning, like how a whole sentence makes sense. But then individual words, those building blocks, those became like a central puzzle, really.
Yeah.
And so today, what we're going to try and do is take you through the core theories, the main sticking points, the debates, but in a way that, we can all relate to.
Right. Spark that philosophical curiosity.
Yeah.
So we're after that aha moment. Not bogged down with jargon, but like a genuine understanding of the big picture.
Exactly.
Okay. So then let's unpack this, I guess. We were starting with something seemingly basic.
Yeah.
Like word. Where does philosophy usually even begin with this?
Well, the entry starts off kind of right away. It points out that the idea of a word isn't as straightforward as we might think. We use the word all the time, obviously, but, a philosopher, the first thing they're going to do is start picking apart those layers of, like, what do we actually mean?
Yeah.
Are we talking about the general word, like, tree? That's the type, right? Or, like, a specific tree printed on a page, like, that's an occurrence. Or even, the actual ink marks on the page.
The physical.
The token, right. But for us, the most useful thing to focus on is the word type, or another way of saying it is the lexeme.
Lexeme.
That's the underlying, like, abstract unit that kind of covers all the different forms of the word. So, like, you think of run.
Good.
Run, runs, running, ran. These are all different forms. But the lexeme, the underlying unit, is run.
Yeah.
That's the abstract meaning unit we're interested in.
So we're talking about that concept, not the physical thing.
Right.
Okay, got it. And then right away, the entry goes on to make this fundamental distinction. Semantic theories versus foundational theories.
Yeah.
Can you break that down a little?
Sure. So a semantic theory of word, meaning basically it tries to answer the question, what are the semantic properties of words?
Mm-hmm.
So, like, if I say square means a four-sided shape, all sides equal, all angles 90 degrees, that's a semantic claim. Like, I'm specifying the meaning. But a foundational theory, it goes deeper.
Okay.
It asks why. Like, why does square have that meaning? Is it, some social agreement, historical usage, maybe something about how our brains are wired?
Ah, I see.
It's a whole other level, right? The entry points out these two are connected for sure. But for our purposes, exploring all these different perspectives, focusing on semantic theories, those different proposals for what word meaning actually is, that's really going to be helpful.
Okay.
Allows us to compare and contrast all these different ways of thinking about this basic unit of language.
Right. So we're charting all the different philosophical answers to what is word meaning. Got it. Now, before we even, jump into those major schools of thought, the entry kind of gives a bit of a historical backdrop and mentions this thing called historical philological semantics, which, from 1870 to 1930, sounds like a very specific way of looking at meaning. What's the central idea there?
So during that time, linguists, they were very focused on, like, the history of words, how meanings change and evolve. Like a word might start with a very concrete meaning.
Right.
And then over time, that meaning broadens or narrows. Maybe it even changes completely, right?
Yeah.
Depending on how people used it. And they also had this, like, psychological view, I guess you could say, of word meaning.
Okay.
They saw it as very connected to concepts or ideas in our minds. So it raised this question, what's the relationship between, like, our lexical semantic competence,
Okay.
that's knowing word meanings, right?
Okay.
And our broader, like, conceptual competence, our general understanding of the world.
So the difference between knowing what chair means
Yeah.
and then, like, understanding everything about chairs.
Yeah, exactly. Like, where does the pure linguistic knowledge end? And then where does, like, the broader knowledge about chairs, their function, history, styles,
Yeah.
where does that all begin? It gets fuzzy.
Right. It's all intertwined.
Okay, so then we move into, I guess, philosophy of language, the early contemporary period. The entry talks about this initial focus on sentences.
Yeah, sentence meaning.
Sentence meaning, right, over individual words. Why was that?
Well, Frege, he was very influential here. And he argued that sentences, those are the primary way that we express thoughts, right? So understanding how a sentence gets its meaning, its truth conditions, like whether it's true or false, that should be like the main focus of philosophy, according to him. Individual words, they were seen as, contributing to the sentence meaning. Their meaning was almost like secondary. But it's worth noting, Frege himself, he didn't completely ignore words. His theory of sense and reference for names and predicates, that's a big one in analytic philosophy.
Yeah, sense and reference.
Yeah. And even though he applied that initially to like logical components of language, not everyday words like dog or something.
Okay.
It can be seen as like a foundational contribution to lexical semantics. Right. And it really did lay the groundwork for a lot that came after.
Exactly. Yeah. And later on, the idea of sense and reference, it was applied more directly to individual words.
I see. But then the entry says that word meaning kind of faded from the spotlight for a bit. What happened?
Well, a couple things. Frege's notion of sense, it was a bit slippery, to be honest. Hard to pin down different interpretations. Russell, for example, he was pretty critical of Fregean semantics.
Right.
Then you have Wittgenstein. In his Tractatus, he was talking about this ideal, logically perfect language, right? And the basic units of meaning there, they were just names. And their meaning, it basically boiled down to what they refer to. And then Tarski, his work on like defining truth in formal languages, that was super influential for semantics as a whole.
Okay.
But he focused on like categorizing words based on, their logical type of reference, like whether they refer to individuals, properties, relations. He didn't really get into the specific semantic differences within those categories.
So dog and cat both refer to individual animals, but he wasn't concerned with that level of distinction.
Yeah, not so much. It was more about the big picture.
The logical structure, the truth conditions.
Exactly.
Okay, then Quine and Church came along. And they're credited with bringing this sense of reference thing back.
Back into the philosophical conversation, yeah.
Yeah. Why was that so important?
Well, they realized even terms that don't refer to anything, like unicorn, right?
Right.
They're not meaningless. In fact, it's because we understand the meaning of unicorn that we can say, okay, well, it doesn't actually exist.
Yeah.
And also, like, going back to Frege's idea about identity statements like the morning star is the evening star. If those were just about two names having the same referent, then they'd be like trivially true, boring. But, that wasn't the case. It was a discovery.
Right.
So that led Carnap to reformulate the whole sense of reference distinction as intension-extension.
Okay. And intention, that's like the...
It's like the concept, the meaning. It picks out like a set of possible things.
Right.
The extension is the actual things it refers to in the real world.
Okay. So bachelor and unmarried man would have the same intention.
Yeah, because they pick out the same set of people in every possible world,
Oh, got it.
Yeah.
And Carnap initially thought knowing a word's intention, that was like our understanding of it.
Right, our lexical semantic competence.
Right. But it wasn't that simple, was it?
No, not quite. Carnap's early system, as groundbreaking as it was, it couldn't really capture all those subtle relationships between words. Like, for example, there was nothing in his system to stop you from having a married bachelor.
Well, that's not right.
Right. That's where Quine comes in with his big critique.
Yeah, he famously challenged that whole distinction between analytic and synthetic truths.
Right.
That was huge.
He was arguing that even statements that seem obviously true by definition, like bachelors are unmarried, in Carnap's system, they came out as synthetic, not analytic.
Meaning their truth depended on something other than just the meaning of the words.
Exactly.
And that led to Carnap adding meaning postulates to his system.
Yeah, those were his way of adding constraints, like rules to the system to make sure it captured those analytic truths.
So like a meaning postulate could say, if X is a bachelor, then X is unmarried.
Exactly. And these postulates, you could think of them as either, limiting which possible worlds we even consider, like which ones are admissible based on our understanding of meaning, or as relativizing, like making analyticity relative to the worlds where that postulate holds true.
I see. So either we're ruling out certain worlds or we're saying, okay, in this world, this is true.
Right, right. It's a way of like making the system more in line with how we actually understand words.
Okay. This feels very much like, trying to build a logical framework for meaning. And then comes Montague, applying these tools to natural language, especially that whole idea of inferential structure. How did word meaning fit into his approach?
Yeah, so Montague, he was super ambitious. He wanted to create this formal system where you could like derive all the valid inferences that a native speaker would naturally make. And some of those inferences, they're based on just logic, right?
That's right.
But others, they depend on the meanings of words. So he used meaning postulates to handle those at first.
Like how you can infer Kim is female from Kim is a mother.
Exactly, yeah. But then people started criticizing this, saying it was blurring the lines between semantics and lexicography.
So theory of meaning versus dictionary making.
Right. The argument was, a semantic theory shouldn't need to include all our world knowledge, like an encyclopedia.
Right. Should be more about the underlying principles.
Yeah, and some later work within Montague's framework did explore things like componential analysis and, meaning postulates more specifically aimed at word meaning.
So there was this back and forth, this tension between this desire for like a clear logical account of language and the messy reality of how words actually work, how they connect to our knowledge.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And that tension is really what fueled this debate about atomism versus holism.
Right. This came after the challenges to those meaning postulates, right?
Right.
Can you kind of outline those two views?
Sure. So atomism in this context, it's the idea that the meanings of individual words, they're like these basic units. You can't break them down any further.
Okay.
But the problem with that is how do you explain those relationships between words?
Right, like red and color.
Yeah, or buy and own.
Yeah.
Holism, on the other hand, it goes to the other extreme. It says that the meaning of a word is fixed by, its place in the entire network of all true sentences in a language.
So to know cat, you have to know every true sentence about cats.
Yeah, basically. And that runs into huge problems.
How could you ever learn a language?
Right. And how could you understand even a single sentence without having, infinite knowledge?
Yeah.
So then molecularism kind of emerged as this middle ground.
Okay.
It says only certain relationships between words are crucial for understanding, for learning.
So it's a network, but a manageable one.
Exactly.
Not these isolated points, but also not this overwhelming interconnected web.
Okay.
Now, Davidson, he comes in with a whole different approach, proposing these things called T-biconditionals as the basis of a theory of meaning, shifting the focus to truth conditions.
Yeah.
What's going on there?
So Davidson, he takes Tarski's work on truth, where, a good definition of truth, it has to entail these T sentences, which are biconditionals, like S is true if and only if P.
Right.
And Davidson, he flips it around. He says, let's assume we already understand truth. And then these T biconditionals, if we have them for every sentence in a language, well, that's a theory of meaning.
So for snow is white, you'd have snow is white is true if and only if snow is white.
Exactly.
Okay.
But when it comes to individual words, this approach, it leads to these things called lexical axioms like man applies to X if and only if X is a man. And critics said those are totally uninformative.
You have to know what man means to understand that.
Exactly, yeah. It's circular. Some Davidsonians pushed back saying, well, those axioms are useful for translating between languages.
Right.
But for a speaker who already understands the language, they're not really explaining anything.
It feels more like restating, not getting at the deeper structure.
Yeah.
Okay. So then we move to the mid-1970s, and Dummett starts asking some probing questions about the role of word meaning in all this. What was his main concern?
Dummett, he argued that if a theory of meaning is supposed to explain our semantic competence, so if you learn the theory, you can use the language,
Right.
It needs to give you more than just the logical type of a word. It needs to reflect a speaker's knowledge of when they'd use a word. So give us some actual information about, say, horse or barn.
Not just that they refer to horses and barns.
Yeah, more than that. He connected this back to Frege's idea of sense, suggesting a theory of meaning should somehow capture the sense of a word.
Okay.
But he didn't really offer a specific format for how to do that. Grandy, he had a similar critique of Montague semantics. He said it provides all these formal structures, but it doesn't actually describe what the meaning functions are.
So the formalism feels detached from our actual understanding.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And then Partee comes in and she argues that structural semantics needs language-to-world grounding.
Right.
What does she mean by that?
So her argument is, just having those rules for combining word meanings and meaning postulates to capture the relationships between words, that's not enough to determine the right interpretation. There needs to be something that anchors the language to the actual world.
Right.
She called that language-to-world grounding. Harnad, he came at this from a more cognitive science angle.
Okay.
He proposed that grounding could be achieved through feature detectors, like little mechanisms that are sensitive to certain properties of objects in the world.
So kind of like how our senses work.
Yeah, in a way. It's a more mechanistic view of grounding.
Okay, and then Marconi, he takes a very cognitive approach, and he makes this distinction between the inferential and referential aspects of lexical competence. What's the importance of that distinction?
Marconi's point is, our competence with a word, it's not just one thing. It has these two parts that can kind of work independently.
Okay.
The inferential part, that's like understanding the word's relationship to other words, synonyms, antonyms,
Right, all right.
And the referential part is about being able to, correctly name things in the world.
Point to a dog and say dog.
Yeah, exactly. And he says these two aspects, they usually work together, but they can, come apart.
Really?
Yeah, and there's some, brain studies that suggest this, which raises all these questions about, what is lexical knowledge? How does individual understanding relate to shared meaning?
It's like we're constantly trying to balance what's in our heads with what's out there in the world. And this leads us to the externalist turn.
Oh, yeah.
A big shift in philosophy of language.
Yep.
Can you break down semantic externalism for us?
This was a huge change in the 70s. It started with Kripke and Putnam. Their main argument was, for some words, like proper names and natural kind terms, gold, tiger. The reference, what they actually pick out in the world, that's not determined by, our internal descriptions or thoughts. And it's determined by these external, objective, causal relationships between us and the world.
Like Putnam's twin Earth thought experiment.
Exactly. It's a classic. He says water refers to different stuff on Earth and twin Earth because the stuff is different, even if people have the same, concept of water in their heads.
Right. So even if we didn't know that water is H2O, we'd still be referring to this stuff?
Exactly, yeah. That indexical element, this liquid, our water, that's key. Now, externalism, it can be used in a broader sense too.
Right.
But this strong version, the Putnamian version, it really emphasizes that reference is independent from our minds.
Okay. And this wasn't just about natural kinds, was it?
No, Putnam extended this to artifacts too, like pencil. He said, pencil would still refer to these writing tools, even if we found out they were some weird natural organism not made by humans.
Like we were wrong about their origins all along.
Yeah.
Okay, but that's sparked debate, hasn't it?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Some people, like Schwartz, they've argued that in that case, we wouldn't really call those things pencils.
Right, like they'd be imposters.
Yeah, suggesting that maybe our beliefs about how things are made, their purpose, maybe that matters more for artifacts.
It's still being debated.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Then there's Burge's social externalism. This takes externalism even further, right?
Right. It's about the community.
Yeah. What's the core argument there?
So Burge says the meaning of a word for a specific speaker, it depends on the whole linguistic community they're part of. So even if you think arthritis can affect muscles, which it doesn't.
Right. That's a common misconception.
When you say arthritis, you're still referring to the joint condition.
Because that's what everyone else means.
Exactly. And this challenges the idea of an individual idiolect, your own personal language.
So we don't each have our own private meanings.
It's more like words only have the meanings that the community gives them.
Okay. Now, both of these externalist views, they focus a lot on reference and outside factors.
Right.
But they don't completely deny the role of our internal knowledge, do they?
No, they don't. They say you need some internal knowledge to be a competent user of a word.
To actually refer to something.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you thought manatees were kitchen appliances, you wouldn't really be referring to manatees.
Right.
Putnam, he talks about stereotypes, those simplified descriptions.
Like typical features.
Yeah. He says those help us communicate, but they're not necessarily the deep meaning that fixes reference.
So there's surface knowledge and then deeper knowledge.
Exactly, yeah. And Burge, he also acknowledges that you need some level of understanding to be part of a linguistic community.
Even if it's not perfect?
Right.
Okay, so this externalist emphasis on the world and the community, it naturally caused some pushback, right?
Yeah.
This led to internalism making a comeback.
All right.
What were the main arguments there?
Internalists felt that externalism put too much emphasis on reference, not enough on, what's going on in our heads. They said, look, there's narrow, meaning that's the internal stuff, concepts, inferences.
Good.
And that's different from wide, meaning, which is the external referential stuff.
And they thought these could vary independently.
Yeah. The idea is our internal state, how we understand a word, that's crucial for explaining our beliefs, our actions.
Right.
They use the Oedipus example a lot.
Oh, yeah, classic.
Oedipus married Jocasta because he thought she was just his wife.
Right, not his mother.
He didn't know that part. So his internal understanding of wife, that's what mattered. That's a case of narrow meaning differing from wide meaning.
It shows that meaning isn't just about pointing at things. It's also about our internal network of concepts.
Exactly.
Okay. So then we get into contextualism, minimalism, and the lexicon.
Yeah.
This is all about, how much context matters.
Right. It's a big debate. Ordinary language philosophers, they'd always emphasize that meaning is tied to use. And different contexts, they can give you different meanings for the same word.
So, there's milk in the fridge. Could mean different things.
Yeah, depending on, are you expecting a whole gallon or just a little bit?
Right.
Grice tried to reconcile this with, a formal approach.
Okay.
He distinguished between, what a sentence asserts its truth conditions and then what it communicates, which he called implicature. And he said context mainly helps us figure out the implicature, not the core meaning.
But then people like Travis and Searle came along.
Right.
They challenged that.
They said context can affect the truth conditions, too.
Even when there are no obvious words like I or here that change with context.
Yeah.
That led to contextualism.
Right. Recanati, Karsten, they're big names there. They argue that, the literal meaning often needs to be enriched by, our background knowledge, the conversational context.
So we need more than just the dictionary definition to understand what someone's saying.
Exactly. And they see words as having, a semantic potential rather than a fixed meaning. Then you have minimalism.
Okay.
People like Bach, they argue that linguistic meaning just provides this, minimal scaffolding.
Yeah, okay.
A propositional radical, they call it. And then our minds do all the work of filling in the details to get to a full proposition.
But the challenge is figuring out what that minimal content actually is, right?
Exactly. How do you isolate it? Stanley, he has this view called indexicalism, where he tries to bridge this gap.
Okay.
He says all the stuff we communicate, it can be traced back to these linguistically controlled elements and conversational norms. It's a generalization of how indexicals like I and here work.
Actually.
And then there's the even more minimalists like Borg, Kaplan, and Lepore.
Okay.
They say, look, semantic theory should only be about literal meaning, the stuff determined by the words themselves.
No context.
No context. And some even equate word meaning with reference.
Which we talked about earlier, and it's not without its problems.
Yeah, it's tough to explain relationships between words if meaning is just reference.
Right.
Okay. Now let's move on to those words that seem to have multiple meanings, vague, ambiguous, all that. The entry does a nice job of categorizing these.
Yeah.
How do these challenge theories of word meaning?
Well, they show that the link between a word and its meaning, it's not always one-to-one, right? So first you have vagueness, which is a property of concepts themselves.
Right, like heap or tall. You can't draw a precise line.
Yeah.
Polysemy is when one word has several meanings.
Okay.
Like line. It can be a physical line, a line of text, a cue.
Or a boundary.
Right. And we distinguish between regular polysemy, where the different meanings follow a pattern, animal and its meat.
Chicken, rabbit, those kinds of things.
Yeah. And then there's more idiosyncratic cases, like run.
Right. Run has so many meanings.
So many, yeah. And then there's homonymy.
Okay.
That's when the meanings are really different.
Like coach, the vehicle, and the person.
Yeah, no obvious connection.
And then some words just happen to have the same form by accident.
Right, historical accident, like the three barks.
Bark of a tree, a dog's bark, and the ship.
Exactly.
Okay.
Right.
So how do we, as speakers, manage all this?
Right. The entry talks about these two main views, sense enumeration and one representation theories. So sense enumeration says for each meaning of a word, we have a separate mental representation.
So for bank, you'd have one for the money place, one for the riverbank.
Yeah. But the one representation view says maybe there's just one underlying representation, either a core meaning or some like richer structure that allows us to access the different senses.
Okay.
Pragmatists, they downplay the role of fixed meanings in these cases. They emphasize context, like memorabilia shop. We don't need a separate entry for that phrase. We figure it out from the words and our world knowledge.
Right.
And Fodor, he took this really far. He said there's no such thing as polysemy.
Wow.
He argued that what seems